intermixed with feats of warlike achievement, and ornamented with abundant quotations from the Persian poets, with whose compositions the orator seemed familiar. The retinue of the physician, such excepted as were necessarily detained in attendance on the camels, thronged up to the narrator, and pressed as close as deference for their master permitted, to enjoy the delight which the inhabitants of the East have ever derived from this species of exhibition. At another time, notwithstanding his imperfect knowledge of the language, Sir Kenneth might have been interested in the recitation, which, through dictate by a more extravagant imagination, and expressed in more inflated and metaphorical language, bore yet a strong resemblance to the romances of chivalry then so fashionable in Europe. But, as matters stood with him, he was scarcely even sensible that a man in the centre of the cavalcade recited and sung, in a low tone, for nearly 2 hours, modulating his voice to the various moods of passion introduced into the tale, and receiving in return, now low murmurs of applause, now muttered expressions of wonder, now sighs and tears, and sometimes, what it was far more difficult to extract from such an audience, a tribute of smiles and even laughter. During the recitation, the attention of the exile, however abstracted by his own deep sorrow, was occasionally awakened by the low wail of a dog, secured in a wicker enclosure suspended on one of the camels, which, as an experienced woodsman, he had no hesitation in recognising to be that of his own faithful hound; and, from the plaintive tone of the animal, he had no doubt that he was sensible of his master's vicinity, and, in his way, invoking his assistance for liberty and rescue. "Alas, poor Roswal," he said, "thou callest for aid and sympathy upon one in stricter bondage than thou art thyself. I will not seem to hear thee or return thy affection, since it would serve but to load our parting with yet more bitterness." Thus passed the hours of night, and the space of dim hazy dawn which forms the twilight of a Syrian morning. But when the very first line of the sun's disk began to rise above the level horizon, and when the very first level ray shot glimmering in dew along the surface of the desert, which the travellers had now attained, the sonorous voice of El Hakim himself overpowered and cut short the narrative of the tale-teller, while he caused to resound along the sands the solemn summons, which the muezzins thundered at morning from the minaret of every mosque. "To prayer, to prayer! God is the one God! To prayer, to prayer! Mohammed is the prophet of God! To prayer, to prayer! Time is flying from you! To prayer, to prayer! Judgment is drawing nigh to you!" In an instant each Moslem cast himself from his horse, turned his face towards Mecca, and performed with sand an imitation of those ablutions which were elsewhere required to be made with water, while each individual, in brief but fervent ejaculations, recommended himself to the care, and his sins to the forgiveness, of God and the Prophet. Even Sir Kenneth, whose reason at once and prejudices were offended by seeing his companions in that which he considered as an act of idolatry, could not help respecting the sincerity of their misguided zeal, and, being stimulated by their fervour to apply supplications to heaven in a purer form, wondering, meanwhile, what new-born feelings could teach him to accompany in prayer, though with varied invocation, those very Saracens, whose heathenish worship he had conceived a crime dishonourable to the land in which high miracles had been wrought, and where the day-star of redemption had arisen. The act of devotion, however, though rendered in such strange society, burst purely from his natural feelings of religious duty, and had its usual effect in composing the spirits which had been long harassed by so rapid a succession of calamities. The sincere and earnest approach of the Christian to the throne of the Almighty teaches the best lesson of patience under affliction, since wherefore should we mock the Deity with supplications, when we insult him by murmuring under his decrees? Or how, while our prayers have in every word admitted the vanity and nothingness of the things of time in comparison to those of eternity, should we hope to deceive the Searcher of hearts, by permitting the world and worldly passions to resume their reigns even immediately after a solemn address to heaven? But Sir Kenneth was not of these. He felt himself comforted and strengthened, and better prepared to execute or submit to whatever his destiny might call upon him to do or to suffer. Meanwhile, the party of Saracens regained their saddles and continued their route, and the tale-teller Hassan resumed the thread of his narrative, but it was no longer to the same attentive audience. A horseman, who had ascended some high ground on the right hand of the little column, had returned on a steady gallop to El Hakim, and communicated with him. 4 or 5 more cavaliers had then been dispatched, and the little band, which might consist of about 20 or 30 persons, began to follow them with their eyes, as men from whose gestures, and advance or retreat, they were to augur good or evil. Hassan, finding his audience inattentive, or being himself attracted by the dubious appearances on the flank, stinted in his song, and the march became silent, save when a camel driver called out to his patient charge, or some anxious follower of the Hakim communicated with his next neighbour in a hurried and low whisper. This suspense continued until they had rounded a ridge, composed of hillocks of sand, which concealed from their main body the object that had created this alarm among their scouts. Sir Kenneth could now see, at the distance of a mile or more, a dark object moving rapidly on the bosom of the desert, which his experienced eye recognised for a party of cavalry, much superior to their own in numbers, and, from the thick and frequent flashes which flung back the level beams of the rising sun, it was plain that these were Europeans in their complete panoply. The anxious looks which the horsemen of El Hakim now cast upon their leader seemed to indicate deep apprehension, while he, with gravity as undisturbed as when he called his followers to prayer, detached 2 of his best mounted cavaliers, with instructions to approach as closely as prudence permitted to these travellers of the desert, and observe more minutely their numbers, their character, and, if possible, their purpose. The approach of danger, or what was feared as such, was like a stimulating draught to one in apathy, and recalled Sir Kenneth to himself and his situation. "What fear you from these Christian horsemen, for such they seem?" he said to the Hakim. "Fear?" said El Hakim, repeating the word disdainfully. "The sage fears nothing but heaven, but ever expects from wicked men the worst which they can do." "They are Christians," said Sir Kenneth, "and it is the time of truce. Why should you fear a breach of faith?" "They are the priestly soldiers of the temple," answered El Hakim, "whose vow limits them to know neither truce nor faith with the worshippers of Islam. May the Prophet blight them, both root, branch, and twig. This peace is war, and their faith is falsehood. Other invaders of Palestine have their times and moods of courtesy. The lion Richard will spare when he has conquered. The eagle Philip will close his wing when he has stricken a prey. Even the Austrian bear will sleep when he is gorged. But this horde of ever-hungry wolves know neither pause nor satiety in their rapine. Seest thou not that they are detaching a party from their main body, and that they take an eastern direction? Yon are their pages and squires, whom they train up in their accursed mysteries, and whom, as lighter mounted, they send to cut us off from our watering place. But they will be disappointed. I know the war of the desert yet better than they." He spoke a few words to his principal officer, and his whole demeanour and countenance was at once changed from the solemn repose of an Eastern sage, accustomed more to contemplation than to action, into the prompt and proud expression of a gallant soldier, whose energies are roused by the near approach of a danger which he at once foresees and despises. to Sir Kenneth's eyes the approaching crisis